The advertisement in the Manitoba Free Press read like something out of a railway pamphlet. Experienced rancher, established operation near Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, comfortable homestead, steady income, seeking capable woman 30 to 40 for household partnership and eventual marriage. Good character required, cooking experience essential. It did not mention that the established operation was 480 acres of wind-scored grassland with a sagging barn, a debt to the bank in Regina, and a cattle herd that had lost 11 head to last winter's cold snap. It did not mention that the comfortable homestead had a roof that wept in heavy rain, or that the nearest neighbor was a widower who had not spoken more than 14 words to anyone since 1908. It did not mention that the man who placed the advertisement had been alone for so long that he had started giving names to the fence posts. The reply from Vivian Ashford described a practical woman of 36, experienced in household management, capable in the kitchen, accustomed to hard work. It mentioned her time keeping house for her widowed father on his farm outside Winnipeg. It did not mention that her father's farm was 40 acres of good Manitoba soil, with a proper well, a hired man, and a kitchen with a cast iron range that cost more than most men made in a month. It did not mention that Vivian had never in her life skinned a rabbit, patched a roof, or done laundry without a washboard that wasn't cracked in 3 places. It did not mention that the reason she answered an advertisement from a stranger in Saskatchewan was that her father had remarried in April. His new wife had made the domestic arrangement very clear, and Vivian Ashford had run out of options faster than she had run out of pride. They were both in the plainest terms, lying through their teeth. They were going to be exactly what the other one needed. Neither of them knew it yet. Harlan Voss was 41 years old and built the way the Saskatchewan prairie builds everything. Low to the ground, stripped of anything unnecessary, shaped entirely by what it had survived. He had come west from Ontario at 22 with $200, and a brother who lasted 1 winter before taking the train back east. Harlan had stayed. He had broken the land himself 1 acre at a time. Through drought years and frost years and the kind of years that didn't have a name except bad. He had married once briefly to a woman named Catherine who had lasted 3 years before deciding that Saskatchewan in February was a form of punishment she had not agreed to. She had left on a Tuesday in 1904 without a note. Harlan had not blamed her. He had also not tried again. Until now. He needed someone who could cook. That was the honest truth of it. He could keep cattle alive through a blizzard. He could fix a pump in the dark with one hand. He could read weather in the color of the afternoon sky. And he had been right about it enough times that his body had such skipping the conscious part and going straight to action. What he could not do, what he had never been able to do and had largely stopped pretending otherwise, was feed himself in any way that resembled a meal. He ate from tins. He ate bread that he bought in town and that was usually 2 days old by the time he got it home. He had once attempted a pot of stew that his dog had refused. He was not looking for company. He was not looking for conversation. He had lived alone long enough that silence had become structural, load-bearing, something he was not sure he could remove without the whole thing coming down. He was looking for someone who could make a meal that did not come from a tin, who could keep the house from becoming something that embarrassed him when the minister came by, and who would not need him to explain himself constantly. That was all. That was everything. He told himself that every morning for the 6 weeks between placing the advertisement and the morning, he drove his wagon to the Moose Jaw station to meet the train from Winnipeg. He had cleaned his boots. He had not cleaned them in a year. Vivian arrived on the CPR line on a Wednesday afternoon in late September 1912, carrying a leather traveling case, a hatbox she had packed with things she considered non-negotiable, and an expression that she had rehearsed in the train window reflection for the last 100 miles. Calm, capable, composed. A woman equal to whatever she was about to find. She was not equal to what she found. The station at Moose Jaw was fine. The town was fine, larger than she had expected, which briefly encouraged her. Then she found Harlan Voss standing beside a wagon at the edge of the platform. And she understood in approximately 4 seconds that the encouragement had been premature. He was tall in the way of a man who had never thought about being tall. He wore a coat that had once been brown and was now the color of the land around it. His hat was practical rather than presentable. He looked at her the way a man looks at the weather, assessing what it was going to cost him. His first thought, which he did not say, "She's brought a hatbox to Saskatchewan." Her first thought, which she did not say, "His wagon has a crack in the footboard held together with fence wire." They shook hands. His were the hands of someone who had been working outside since before she was born. Hers were the hands of a woman who had been doing more work than she let on, but not that kind of work. He noticed the difference, so did she. The drive to the ranch took an hour and 20 minutes. The conversation took up approximately 6 minutes of that. He told her the lay of the land, where the nearest town was, what the cattle situation was. She asked practical questions and he answered them briefly. The rest was silence and wind and the enormous Saskatchewan sky pressing down on everything like a second ceiling. When they arrived, she looked at the house, then she looked at the barn. Then she looked back at the house in case she had misjudged. She had not misjudged. The house was 2 stories, but the second story was more of an intention than a fact. 3 rooms with slanted ceilings and windows that let in the cold through gaps that someone had attempted to stuff with rags. The kitchen was on the main floor. A wood stove, a dry sink, a table with 4 chairs, only 2 of which were the same height, and a shelf that held 6 tins of bully beef and a jar of something that had lost its label and its color. The floor was wood, which was better than she had feared, but it hadn't been properly scrubbed since the previous owner. She said, "Your advertisement mentioned a comfortable homestead." He said, "It's warmer than a tent." She said, "I have never lived in a tent." That is not a reassuring comparison. He looked at her for a moment, then he carried her traveling case inside. That first evening Vivian made supper. She had told the agency she was experienced in the kitchen. This was true in the sense that she had been present in kitchens for most of her life, and had on several occasions directed the preparation of meals when their hired woman was unwell. What she had not done, not with any real frequency, was cook on a wood stove that ran 30 degrees hotter on the left side than the right, with no proper measuring cups, in a kitchen where the only fat available was a tin of lard the consistency of old candle wax. The biscuits came out pale on top and burnt on the bottom. The salt pork was edible in the center and carbonized at the edges. The tea was strong enough to strip varnish, which she had been told was how ranch hands preferred it, so she chose to consider that a success. Harlan ate everything on his plate. He did not say a word about any of it. He washed his own cup afterward and set it on the shelf and said, "Early start tomorrow," and went to bed. Vivienne sat alone in the kitchen for a long time, looking at the window and the darkness beyond it, and the small reflection of a woman she barely recognized. A woman who was 36 years old, and had traded one precarious situation for another, and was now going to have to figure out how to cook on a wood stove that she suspected was trying to kill her. She did not cry. She had decided on the train that she was not going to cry, and she was, if nothing else, good at deciding things, and then following through on them out of sheer stubbornness. What she did was take out the small notebook she kept in her coat pocket and write down every single thing that had gone wrong with supper, in order, with possible causes. When she was finished, the list was 11 items long. Then she wrote at the bottom, "Start again in the morning." What Harlan did not know, what he could not have guessed from her composed face, and her careful questions, and the way she had looked at the house without flinching, or at least without flinching visibly, was that Vivian Ashford had not answered his advertisement because she was looking for a ranch. She was looking for ground, something to stand on. Her father, a man called George Ashford, who had farmed the same land outside Winnipeg for 30 years, and who Vivian had loved in the complicated, largely unspoken way of prairie families, had remarried in April 1912 to a woman named Harriet, who was pleasant and efficient, and who had made it understood within 3 weeks that the arrangement of 2 women in one household was not going to suit. Harriet had not said this unkindly. She had not needed to. Vivian was 36 and unmarried and had no income of her own and had been managing her father's house since her mother died in 1903. That was the entirety of her professional experience, and it was not transferable to any occupation that paid. She had gone to Winnipeg and inquired about teaching positions, and been told she did not have the certification. She had inquired about bookkeeping, and been told they were not currently hiring women. She had sat in her cousin's spare room for 2 weeks and run the numbers on her small savings, and understood, with the cold clarity of a woman who had always been better at arithmetic than sentiment, that she had approximately 4 months before she would be genuinely destitute. The matrimonial advertisement had been her cousin's suggestion, offered gently as a last resort, not because Vivienne was incapable of attracting a husband under normal circumstances, but because the circumstances were not normal and time was the one thing she did not have. She had pictured, from the language of his advertisement, established operation, comfortable homestead, steady income, something manageable, a man with some means, a proper house, work she could learn. She was not romantic about it. She did not need to be happy. She needed to be useful, and she needed not to be a burden, and she had come a very long way to make that happen. What she had not pictured was this: the wind that came under the door like something with purpose. The pump in the yard that required a specific aggressive technique she had not been shown yet. The vast indifference of the land in every direction, flat and brown, and going on past the point where the eye could make sense of it. She had stood on the porch that first night, after Harlan was asleep, and looked out at the darkness and the stars, which were absurd in their abundance out here, and she had thought, "This is what I have chosen. Now choose it properly." In the morning, she woke before him. She studied the stove for 20 minutes before she lit it. She opened every cupboard and inventoried what was there. When Harlan came downstairs at 5:30, she was standing in the kitchen with her sleeves rolled up and her notebook open on the table. She said, "I need you to show me how this stove works. The left side runs hot. I need to know by how much." He said, "You woke up early." She said, "I made a list of 11 things that went wrong with last night's supper. I'd like to go through them." He looked at the list, he read it, which surprised her. She had not expected him to actually read it. Then he looked at her with an expression she could not quite read and said, "The left side runs about 40 degrees hotter. You need to rotate whatever you're baking at the 12-minute mark." She wrote that down. He said, "You really can't cook." She said, "I can cook. I've been cooking wrong equipment. Show me the right technique once and I'll have it." He said, "Once?" She said, "I don't make the same mistake twice. I make new ones, but not the same ones." Harlan Voss looked at Vivian Ashford standing in his dirt-ringed kitchen at 5:30 in the morning with her notebook, and her list of 11 failures and her absolute refusal to treat those failures as anything other than data, and felt something shift in him that he would not have been able to name. It was not attraction, not yet. It was something more like recognition. Like seeing in another person a quality you had always relied on in yourself and had not expected to find in anyone else. He sat down at the table and started explaining the stove. The weeks that followed were not easy. I want to be clear about that, because the easy version of this story would have them finding their rhythm quickly, settling into something warm and mutual without friction. That is not what happened. What happened was that two people who had spent their adult lives doing exactly what they wanted without consulting anyone had to share a kitchen, a table, a set of unspoken rules, and approximately 900 square feet of house during the months when the weather made outdoor work impossible for hours at a time. Vivian learned the stove. She learned it the way she learned everything, systematically and without sentiment, through error and correction. And the notebook that was never far from her coat pocket. The biscuits improved in stages, first edible then consistent then, by November, something that Harlan reached for a second time without being asked. She learned to deal with the pump, which required you to prime it with water from a tin you kept on the windowsill, and then apply your weight to it in a specific rocking motion that looked, she told herself, exactly as undignified as it felt. She learned to bank the fire overnight, so the kitchen was not below freezing when she came down in the morning. She learned to read the weather from the sky over the western tree line. The particular yellow-gray that meant a system was coming. The false calm that sometimes preceded the worst days. She also learned things that were harder to write in a notebook. She learned that Harlan was not in fact unkind. He was simply not accustomed to considering how his habits affected another person, because for 8 years there had been no other person. He forgot to tell her things she needed to know. That the well had a slow day on Fridays when someone upstream was watering cattle. That the second step on the porch was rotted, and would hold your weight once but not twice. That the dog was friendly to everyone, except men who came to the door in hats, that looked like a hat his former brother-in-law had owned, which was specific enough that she chose to simply introduce herself to every visitor before they got within 10 feet of the porch. She learned these things the hard way, which was the only way there was, and she filed them in the notebook and she stopped making those mistakes. What Harlan learned took him longer to admit, even to himself. He had ordered a capable woman, a practical woman, someone who would manage the domestic situation, and leave him to manage everything else and would not require him to explain himself or alter the patterns of a life. He had organized very carefully around the fact of being alone. What had arrived was a woman who, within 3 weeks, had reorganized his pantry in a way that made everything findable, which he had not previously thought was possible. Who had patched the gap under the kitchen door with a strip of leather that she had cut herself from a piece he had been meaning to use for exactly that purpose for 2 years. Who had looked at the account book he kept on the shelf, the record of what the operation owed the bank in Regina, and had said, quietly, one evening, "You've been paying the interest and not the principal. Do you want me to show you how to restructure this?" He had stared at her. She had said, "My father never trusted the bank either. I learned to read loan agreements because no one else was going to." He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he took the account book down from the shelf and handed it to her. What she showed him over the next hour, calmly, without making him feel foolish for not having seen it himself, which was the thing he would remember longest, was that the repayment structure he had agreed to in 1908 had been written in a way that benefited the bank considerably more than it benefited the borrower, and that with 2 adjustments and a letter drafted carefully, he could restructure the debt and cut 7 years off the repayment timeline. He said, "Where did you learn that?" She said, "I told you, my father's farm. And I read a great deal." He said. "You read?" She said constantly, "I find it useful." "Is that a problem?" He said after a moment, "No." He did not tell her then that he had 3 books in the house, a Bible, a seed catalog, and a manual for a piece of machinery he no longer owned, and that he had not read anything for pleasure since he was a boy and his mother had read to him in the evenings. He did not tell her that the idea of reading for pleasure had come to seem like something that belonged to a different kind of life, a softer life, one he had decided he was not living. He told her in December, when she had written to her cousin, and asked her to send whatever books could be spared, and a crate had arrived containing 9 volumes, which Vivienne had arranged on the shelf above the window with an efficiency and a care that made clear they were not decorative. He had picked one up. He did not say anything about it, but she noticed. I have told this story to a few people over the years, and the part they always want to know about, the part that seems to matter most, is the night in February 1913. The winter of that year was not the worst Saskatchewan had seen, but it was bad enough. The temperature on the 14th of February. And yes, I am aware of the date. The irony was not lost on anyone. Dropped to -38 overnight, the kind of cold that does not announce itself but simply arrives, a wall of it, and everything in its path either endures or does not. At 11 o'clock at night, Harlan's lead mare went into distress in the barn. It was not foaling season. The mare, a grey named Prue that he had owned for 9 years and that he would have described, if pressed, as the most consistently reliable thing in his life, had gotten into something in the south pasture in the autumn that had worked through her system slowly, and was now causing problems that required him to be in the barn, in -38, doing things that could not wait until morning. He did not ask Vivienne to come. She was a woman from Winnipeg, a woman who had grown up on a grain farm, not a horse operation, and who had been in Saskatchewan for 4 months and who was, as far as he knew, asleep in the room at the top of the stairs. He went out alone, the way he had gone out alone to every emergency on this ranch for 8 years, because that was the kind of man he was and the kind of operation he ran. He did not hear her come into the barn until she was already there. She was wearing her coat over her nightclothes, her feet in her barn boots, her hair still plaited from sleep, carrying the lantern from the kitchen hook. She looked at the mare and she looked at Harlan and she said, "Tell me what you need." He said, "You don't have to be out here," she said. "I'm already out here. Tell me what you need." He needed light. He needed consistent, steady light in a specific position that left both his hands free, because what he was dealing with required both hands and his full attention. And he had been managing without a second person on this ranch for so long that he had stopped accounting for what a second person would make possible. She held the lantern. She held it for an hour and 40 minutes, not moving, not shifting, not asking questions while Harlan worked. Her arm began to shake at around the 40-minute mark. Not from fear, she would tell herself later, but from the cold and the sustained effort of holding something absolutely still. And she stopped the shaking by gripping the handle harder, and thinking about the notebook and the 11 things she had written down and how she did not make the same mistake twice. The mare came through. It was not a certainty, and then it was the kind of shift that happens in animal work when the crisis turns and you can feel it before you can see it. Harlan straightened up. He let out a breath that turned to ice before it reached the barn wall. He looked at Vivienne. Her face was white in the lantern light. Her grip on the handle had locked up from the cold, her fingers unable to release on their own. He did not think about it. He set down what he was holding and he took her hand, both hands, one at a time, and he breathed on them. Long, slow, deliberate breaths, one finger at a time, until she could open her hand on her own. It took a while. Neither of them spoke during this. When her hands were back, she said, "Your advertisement said established operation," he said. "Your letter said capable in the kitchen." She said, "I'm getting there." He said, "You are." She said, "We've both been somewhat liberal with the truth." He said after a pause, "I'd say the same things again." She looked at him. The mare was settling behind them, the barn smelling of hay and cold and effort. She said, "So would I." They stood there in the barn in the dark in February for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then they went inside. They were married in May 1913 in Moose Jaw by a minister who had known Harlan for 12 years, and who told Vivienne afterward quietly that he had never expected to see it happen. She had said just as quietly, "Neither had I." She was not talking about herself. The years that followed were the kind that don't get written about, because they don't contain disasters. They contain work and weather and the slow accumulation of a life that is larger than either person expected when they started building it. Harlan paid off the bank debt in Regina by 1919, 6 years ahead of the original schedule. The restructured loan had been Vivienne's idea, drafted in her handwriting, sent under his signature, because that was how it worked in 1913, and she was practical about what she could and could not change. The ranch grew. The cattle herd recovered. The barn roof was replaced with proper material, then the house roof, then the house itself. Not rebuilt but renovated, room by room over 4 winters, until it was something that could hold a family without apologizing for itself. They had 2 children, a daughter born in 1914, and a son born in 1917, who arrived during a week when the weather was so bad that the doctor couldn't get out from town, and Vivienne delivered him herself with Harlan's help, and a very clear set of instructions she gave him in a calm voice while doing something that was emphatically not calm. Vivienne taught them both to read before they could properly walk. Harlan taught them both to work as soon as they could hold a tool. Neither parent made a particular speech about this. It was simply what was expected, and the children understood it, the way children understand the rules of the household they grow up in, completely without question, as though no other arrangement existed. The bookshelf grew until it required a second one. Harlan read through them slowly, The way he did everything without hurry. He told their neighbor, a man named Kopal, who had moved in from Manitoba in 1916, that he had started reading because his wife had left books where he kept sitting down. Kopal had laughed. Harlan had not corrected the impression. The notebook, the small one she had brought from Winnipeg, the one with the 11 failures of the First Supper listed inside the front cover, lived on the shelf next to the books. She never threw it out. Over the years she filled 4 more like it. Records of what worked and what didn't, adjustments and corrections. The accumulated knowledge of a woman who had arrived, not knowing how to do most of what was required of her, and had decided that was not a permanent condition. Harlan, who found the notebooks once while she was out and read through 3 of them, put them back exactly where they had been and did not mention it. Except that he built her a proper desk the following winter, in the room at the front of the house, where the light was good. He was not a natural carpenter. The desk was slightly uneven on the left side. She used it for 30 years. Vivian Ashford Voss became known in the district as the person to ask when you needed something calculated, drafted or organized. She wrote letters for people who couldn't write them. She helped 3 separate families negotiate with the bank in Regina, using the same approach she had applied to Harlan's debt. She became, over time, a kind of unofficial resource for the women of the area who had come west expecting one thing and found something considerably harder, and who needed more than anything to know that harder was survivable. Harlan, for his part, never advertised this and never discouraged it. He built a second room onto the house in 1922, which had a door to the outside, which meant people could come and go without coming through the kitchen. When his son asked him why he'd done it, he said, "Your mother does good work. She needs a proper place to do it." He said it the way he said most things, briefly without elaboration as though the meaning were obvious. She heard him from the kitchen. She did not say anything, but he came in for supper that evening, and there was a piece of apple cake on his plate that had not been on anyone else's, he understood. Harlan Voss died in 1941, at the age of 70. He died in the house, in the bedroom with the window that looked out over the south pasture, in the middle of March when the snow was still on the ground. His wife was with him. Vivian lived until 1954. She was 78. She kept the notebooks until the end, and in the last one, in handwriting that had gotten slower but not shakier, she had written, at some point in the 1940s, a line without date or context. "I arrived not knowing how to do anything that was needed. I left knowing how to do most of it. That seems like a reasonable account of a life." She had come expecting a manageable situation. He had come expecting someone to solve the problem of his kitchen and leave everything else alone. They were both wrong about what they needed, and what they built instead. Out of a cracked footboard and 11 supper failures and a lantern held steady in -38 degrees, was more than either of them had been trying to build. That is the thing about expectations. They tell you what you think you want. They are almost never right about what you actually need. So I'll leave you with this, the question I always come back to with a story like theirs. Who do you think had further to travel, Harlan, who had to learn to let someone in after 8 years of choosing not to, or Vivienne, who had to build an entirely new life from nothing, in a place she had not chosen, with skills she did not yet have? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, there's another one, right? A different ranch, a different decade. The same truth about what 2 stubborn people can build when they stop waiting to be what the other one expected.